I remember the taste of that morning. Cold coffee in a chipped mug. The kind of bitterness that doesn't wake you up. It just reminds you that you're awake. Outside my studio window in Boston, the October rain came down sideways. The wind was picking the leaves off the maple tree across the street and slapping them flat against the glass. My eviction notice was taped to the door. Red ink. Final warning. 30 days. $94,000 in student loans sitting in a drawer like a sleeping animal. 2 unpaid electric bills behind it. A pink slip from the Boston Public School District underneath that, dated the previous Friday, telling me that my position as a middle school art teacher had been eliminated due to budget cuts effective at the end of the term. I was 27 years old, and I had $93 in my checking account. That was when the phone rang. A man's voice, calm, expensive, the kind of voice that does not raise itself for anyone. He said his name was Wendell Hollister. He said he was calling on behalf of the estate of Silas Donovan. He said my grandfather had passed away the previous evening at a hospital in Upper Manhattan. He said the funeral had already been held in accordance with my grandfather's written instructions in a small private ceremony. He said I needed to come to New York for the reading of the will. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't know how to cry for a man I had only really known for 6 months. My name is Eloin Donovan. And 2 weeks after that phone call, I stood in a polished mahogany conference room on the 48th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and I listened to a stranger read me a sentence that cracked my chest open. To my biological granddaughter, Eloin Donovan, who never once asked me for a dime, I leave exactly that. The sum of $1. $1. The woman across the table laughed. But before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the farm and the letters and the night the windows broke, I need you to understand who I was and who he was and why a single crumpled dollar bill became the most precious thing I have ever owned. So, let me start at the beginning. I grew up in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a triple-decker house in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. The radiators hissed in the winter. The fire escape rattled in the wind. My father, Alistair Donovan, was an architect, tall, quiet, with paint on his fingers and a soft Tennessee accent he could never quite shake, no matter how many years he lived up north. He drew his blueprints by hand even after every other architect in the city had gone digital. He said a building should be born from a person, not a machine. My mother taught 4th grade at the public elementary school 3 blocks from our apartment. She made beef stew every Sunday in the same dented pot that her own mother had made stew in. She sang along to old country music on the radio while she washed dishes. She and my father slow danced in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, both of them in their pajamas, while the bacon burned and I laughed at them from the doorway. I had one memory of a farm, just one. I was 3 years old. I remember the smell of dry hay. I remember a porch swing painted white. I remember a woman with silver hair pressing a warm biscuit into my hand and laughing when the butter melted down my wrist and dripped off my elbow onto the porch boards. I remember the sound of a screen door and the smell of clover and a barn cat with green eyes that let me feed it pieces of apple. That was the last summer my father ever took me there. I didn't know why. Children don't ask why. They just notice when something stops. When I was 22 years old, I was a senior at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, studying art education. It was a wet, gray Saturday in March. My parents had driven down to visit an old college friend of my father's who lived outside Nashville. They had been gone 4 days. They were supposed to come back on Sunday afternoon. My mother had promised to bring me a tin of pecan cookies from a bakery in Tennessee that she had loved since she was a teenager. On the way back, somewhere on a rain-slick stretch of highway in Virginia, a semi-truck jackknifed in front of them on a bridge. The state trooper who called me did not give me details. He said my parents were gone. He said it had been fast. He told me to sit down before he said the rest. I was sitting on the floor of my dorm room. I was already sitting down. I buried them on a Tuesday. Closed caskets. There weren't many relatives at the funeral. My mother's sister came down from a small town in Maine, but she had 3 kids of her own and a husband on disability, and she could not take me in. A few of my dad's old colleagues came in dark suits. They shook my hand. They told me my father had been the best of them. They left. And one man I had never seen before, a tall, stooped lawyer in a charcoal suit with iron gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen too many other Tuesdays just like this one. He stood at the back of the church. He waited until everyone else had gone. Then he came up to me at the door, and he slipped a small white card into my hand, and he said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. If you ever need anything, child, anything at all, you call this number. I never called. For 5 years after my parents died, I lived alone in that same small apartment in Dorchester. I kept the rent paid by working 2 jobs. I finished my degree at Pratt by taking out more loans. I came home to Boston and got a job teaching middle school art. I painted on weekends in the kitchen with the windows open, listening to the same country music my mother used to play. I told myself I was fine. I told myself loneliness was just a season. I told myself this was what being an adult looked like. I did not have a single living grandparent that I knew of. Both of my mother's parents had died before I was born. My father had never spoken about his family except to say once when I was 9 and asked that he had a father in New York who was not a kind man and that I was not to worry about him. So I did not. I grew up believing I had no one in this world but my mother and father. And then, when I was 22, I grew up believing I had no one at all. Then, 6 months ago, on a rainy April afternoon, the phone rang. It was the same tall lawyer, Wendell Hollister. His voice was older than I remembered, but I knew it the moment he spoke. He told me my grandfather, Silas Donovan, was dying. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctors had given him a month, maybe 2. He was at a large oncology hospital in Upper Manhattan. He had asked, just once, to see me before the end. I sat very still with the phone against my ear. Why did he never reach out to me? I said, before. He did, child, Wendell said softly. He did. We can talk about that when you come, if you come. I was on a bus to New York that night. I don't know what I expected. I think I expected a stranger. A wealthy old man in a silk robe surrounded by nurses and machines. Someone who would look at me like an obligation he was trying to settle before he died. What I found was a small gray man in a hospital bed. Tubes in his arm, oxygen in his nose. Skin like paper that has been folded too many times. His white hair was so thin I could see the shape of his skull beneath it. He was 81 years old, and he looked 100. He was watching the television on the wall with the sound turned off. Some old black and white Western movie. Cowboys riding across a dry landscape, their mouths moving silent. He turned his head when he heard the door. His eyes found me in the doorway, and his eyes filled up with tears so fast he had to look away. Elowen, he whispered. My God, you have your daddy's eyes. I came to that hospital every Sunday for 6 months. I took the early bus down from Boston, 5 hours each way. I left my apartment at 4:30 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and a tote bag and the same paperback novel I had been reading for 3 weeks but never finished because I was not really reading on those buses. I was looking out the window. I was thinking. I was wondering what I would say to a man I did not know. I brought him black and white cookies from a little Italian bakery in Astoria. He had mentioned them on my second visit. He said they tasted almost right, whatever that meant. So every Sunday after that, I bought a bag of them on my way through the city. And I unwrapped them on the rolling tray table by his bed, and I broke them into small pieces because his throat was too sore to swallow whole bites. I held his hand. His hand was so light, it felt like holding a folded napkin. I read to him from his favorite book, a worn paperback novel he had carried with him for 40 years. The cover was missing. The spine was held together with old yellowed tape. It was a story about a man who built a house with his own 2 hands. A man who refuses to let other people tell him what his work is worth. He told me stories, not about money, not about business, not about Manhattan or Wall Street or boardrooms or the company he had spent his life building. He told me about a green pasture. He told me about an old oak tree with a tire swing that had hung from one of its lower branches for 60 years and had finally rotted through the year my father turned 12. He told me about a barn that smelled like clover in July, about a creek where the minnows flashed silver in the shallows, about a horse named Beauty who had let my father, when my father was very small, sleep on her warm back in the field. I thought he was rambling. I thought the morphine was carrying him somewhere I couldn't follow. I had no idea he was trying to give me a map. One Sunday in late September, when his hands were thin enough that I could see the bones beneath the skin, he reached under his pillow and pulled out something small and warm. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. It was a key, old, brass, worn smooth from years of being carried in a pocket. "When you feel most betrayed," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the hum of the IV machine. "You remember this key, Eloan. You remember that your old grandfather loved you. You remember—" I did not understand. I thought it was the morphine talking again. I tucked the key into the inside pocket of my coat. I went home that night on the bus, and I held the key in my hand all the way back to Boston. He died 11 days later, in the cold blue hour just before dawn. The nurse called me at 7 in the morning. She said he had gone in his sleep. She said it had been peaceful. And 2 weeks after that, I walked into a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, wearing a thrift store blazer with a small ink stain on the cuff, and shoes I had polished with a paper napkin in the lobby bathroom, and I met the rest of my family for the very first time. The conference room smelled like lilies and old money. Vivian Ashcombe sat at the far end of a table the size of a small boat. She was 54 years old, tall, thin in a way that you could tell took work. She was draped in a black designer suit with sharp shoulders, her wrists weighed down with heavy gold bracelets, her ears glittering with diamonds. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly that the skin at her temples looked stretched. She did not look like a grieving widow. She looked like a woman about to sign a merger. Next to her sat her son, Dorian Ashcombe, 32 years old, sandy hair, capped teeth, a heavy gold class ring on one finger from a private business school down in Tennessee that he had not earned and had not finished. He wore an expensive watch that he kept tilting toward the light. He was spinning a set of car keys around his other finger like a child with a fidget toy. When I walked in, Dorian looked up and smirked. "Well, look who took the bus," he said. "Didn't think you'd bother showing up, sweetheart." "I came to pay my respects," I said, very quietly. Vivian didn't even look up from her phone. "Save the performance, darling. We all know why you're here." I sat as far from them as I could. I put my hands in my lap. I tried not to look at the way Dorian's keys caught the light. I tried not to think about the fact that the $93 in my checking account had gone down to $41 after the round-trip bus ticket from Boston. The heavy oak doors opened, and Wendell Hollister walked in. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with iron gray hair and a charcoal suit that looked like it had been cut for him by a craftsman, not a tailor. He carried a leather portfolio that he set down on the table with the gentleness of a man placing a hand on a coffin. He nodded to Vivienne. He nodded to Dorian. He looked at me for just a moment longer, and his eyes had something in them that I did not yet understand. He sat down. He opened the portfolio. He began to read. I tuned out the legal language, the wherefores and the in accordance withs. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure the others could hear it. I didn't care about money. I didn't. I just wanted to know that those 6 months by his bed had mattered. I just wanted to hear my name said with love in a public room. To my stepson, Dorian Ashcombe, I leave the controlling shares of Donovan Textiles, along with the commercial real estate holdings in Chicago, Illinois. Dorian stopped spinning his keys. A slow, greedy grin spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands behind his head. To my wife, Vivian Ashcombe, I leave the primary residence on Fifth Avenue, the summer estate in Southampton, the 90-foot yacht, and all liquid assets currently held at the primary brokerage account. Vivian let out a soft, satisfied sigh. She set down her phone for the first time. She finally looked at me, and her eyes. Her eyes were lit with such a cold, victorious light that I felt it in my teeth. Wendell paused. He turned the final page. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for half a second, just half a second, I saw something in them that looked like pity. And under the pity, something else. Something steadier. Something almost like a promise. And finally, to my biological granddaughter, Elo and Donovan, who never once asked me for a dime, I leave exactly that, the sum of $1. This is my final and deliberate bequest. The room went silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind of silence that presses on your sternum like a hand. The kind of silence you can hear your own pulse inside of. I stopped breathing. $1. It wasn't the absence of an inheritance. It was a sentence. A sentence written in legal ink that would live in the public record for the rest of time. Silas Donovan looked his only granddaughter in the eye and gave her $1. Then Dorian burst out laughing. He slammed his palm on the table. Tears of mirth gathered in the corners of his eyes. He pointed a finger at me. $1, he gasped. Oh, the old man had a sense of humor at the end. Don't spend it all in one place, Ellie. Maybe you can buy a piece of gum. Vivian chuckled. A dry, papery sound. Well, she said, her voice silk over steel, I suppose he saw right through your little hospital visits after all. Did you really think a few cheap cookies were going to buy you a piece of my empire? She set down her phone. You're dismissed, sweetheart. You have no further business here. The blood rushed up to my face. My eyes burned. My throat closed. I felt like my skin was the only thing holding my body together, and even that felt thin. I would not cry in front of her. I would not. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. I turned and walked out of the room, and behind me, Dorian's laughter rolled like a wave. I made it to the elevator bank before the tears spilled over. I jabbed the down button with a shaking hand. I had spent 6 months at his bedside. I had grieved that man before he was even gone. I had loved him, and he had used his last legal act on this earth to make me a punchline. Ding. The elevator door slid open. I stepped inside, and I prayed for the door to close before anyone saw my face. Hold the doors, please. A long arm shot out between the closing doors. Wendell Hollister stepped into the cab. He swiped a keycard over the panel and pressed a button for a sub-basement I hadn't known existed. The doors slid shut. The elevator began to fall. I turned to the wall and dragged my sleeve across my eyes. Mr. Hollister, if there are papers to sign for the dollar, you can mail them to my apartment. There are no papers to sign, Elwin. His voice had changed. Gone was the cold, formal lawyer from the boardroom. What I heard now was quieter, gentler, almost trembling. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy object, a crisp $1 bill sealed inside a thick acrylic case, the kind of case collectors use for rare currency. He held it out to me. Is this a joke? I whispered. Did you come down here to laugh too? Take it, he said. Look at the serial number. I took the case. Through the tears, I squinted at the green ink on the bill. The serial number was not normal, it read. CEDARHOLLOW 1962. I looked up at him. What is this? The elevator plunged. Floor numbers blinked by. 38, 35, 30. Your grandfather loved you very much, Elowen, Wendell said. But he was trapped. Vivian had her claws so deep into his public assets that if he had left you $1 million in that will, she would have buried you in probate court for the next 30 years. She would have bled you dry on legal fees until you walked away with nothing. She would have ruined you. So he left me $1 to protect you. In the state of New York, if a direct descendant is completely omitted from a will, they have grounds to contest it. By leaving you exactly $1, your grandfather proved to the court that he was of sound mind, that he knew exactly who you were, that his choice was deliberate. She cannot challenge it. The public will is ironclad. But it's still just $1, I said. My voice broke on the last word. No, Wendell said. The elevator slowed. What happened upstairs was theater, a performance designed to satisfy Vivian's greed and make her drop her guard. The doors opened on a dim parking garage that smelled of concrete and engine oil. The penthouse, the yacht, the company, they're heavily leveraged. Your grandfather quietly took out enormous loans against every public asset in his estate. He had 18 months to do it. He used them. In 6 months, when the balloon payments come due, Vivienne and Dorian will discover they did not inherit an empire. They inherited $1 billion in toxic debt. My jaw dropped. What? Come with me, he said. Your real inheritance is a 16-hour drive from here, and I would like you to see it before her accountants start asking questions. If you're still with me. If your heart is racing the way mine was in that parking garage, please take a moment right now and tap the subscribe button. Leave a comment and tell me. Have you ever been humiliated by someone who underestimated you? Have you ever held a single dollar bill in your hand and wondered if anyone in this world truly loved you? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. Wendell led me to a parking spot in the back corner of the garage. I expected a town car, a Lincoln, something with tinted windows and a leather interior and a driver in a dark suit. Instead, parked in the dim fluorescent light, was a battered, dust-colored Ford F-150 pickup truck, maybe 10 years old. A crack across the windshield, a small dent in the back fender, a faded sticker on the back bumper that said Cedar Hollow Volunteer Fire Department. He saw my face and almost smiled. This was his, he said. He kept it parked at a friend's place in Queens. He flew up here for business, but when he came home, really came home, he drove this. I climbed in. The seat smelled like old leather and pipe tobacco. The leather was cracked across the bench. There was a thermos in the cup holder and an empty coffee cup and a road map of Tennessee folded on top of the dashboard, soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded too many times. There was a small, faded photograph clipped to the visor, a little boy of about 10, with sun-bleached hair and a gap between his front teeth, standing in a pasture, holding a fishing pole almost as tall as he was. He was grinning at the camera like he had just been told the best joke of his life. It was my father. I touched the photograph with one finger, and the lump in my throat got so big I couldn't speak. Wendell turned the key. The engine rumbled to life like a sleeping dog. He backed out of the parking spot. We came up the ramp and into the cold gray afternoon, and we turned south. We drove for 16 hours. For 16 hours, the truck carried us out of the gray concrete of New York and down through the brown forests of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We stopped once for gas in Maryland and once for coffee at a diner outside Roanoke, where the waitress called Wendell honey and refilled his cup without asking. We drove through the long, curving valleys of Virginia, across the Smoky Mountains in the cold blue hour just before dawn, and somewhere around 8 in the morning on a country road outside of Nashville, the world opened up. Pastures, green and rolling even in late October. Horse fences painted white, running along the road for half a mile at a stretch. A red barn with the sun catching the tin roof. A black and white cow lifting her head from the grass to watch us go by. Wendell talked the whole way. He told me my grandfather had not been born rich. He had grown up on a small dairy farm in eastern Tennessee, the third of 6 children. He had ridden a tractor before he could ride a bicycle. He had milked cows at 4:30 in the morning before walking 3 miles to a one-room schoolhouse where one teacher taught all 8 grades. He had gone to New York at 22 with $80 in his pocket and a borrowed suit and a single suitcase. He had taken a job sweeping floors at a textile warehouse in Brooklyn. Within 5 years, he was running the warehouse. Within 10, he had bought it. Within 20, he had built Donovan Textiles into a company that supplied half the major department stores in the country. He had married my grandmother, Mary, in 1969. She was the daughter of a Tennessee preacher. They had gone home to the farm every summer of their married life. She had been the love of his life. She had died of breast cancer when my father, Alistair, was 16 years old. A year later, on a business trip in Boston, my grandfather had met Vivienne. She was 30 years younger. Beautiful, polished, hungry. She was working as a buyer for a Boston department store. She knew exactly who he was. She didn't love him, Wendell said quietly, his eyes on the road. She loved his name. and she hated everything about Tennessee. She called the farm a pile of country mud. She forbade him from bringing his son and, later, his granddaughter back there. She told him it was beneath the family, beneath the Donovan name. Even though the Donovan name had been carved on a fence post in Cedar Hollow for 130 years before she ever heard it. He paused. Your father came down anyway, in secret. He brought your mama. He brought you when you were little. The last time you were here, you were 3. You sat on the parlor rug at the farmhouse and tried to feed an apple to a barn cat. Your daddy was so proud, Elwyn. He had plans. He wanted to leave Boston. He wanted to move the 3 of you back to the farm. He had been talking to your grandfather for years about taking over the land. Why did we stop coming, I asked. Because Vivienne found out she had your daddy followed. We think she paid a private investigator. When she found the photographs, she went straight to Silas. She told him if Alistair didn't break off all contact with the farm, she would destroy him. She would manufacture documents. She would make it look like he had stolen from his own father's company. She had the money to invent anything. And Silas believed her. He had to, because by then she had her name on enough of his accounts to do exactly what she said she would do. He glanced at me, then back at the road. His knuckles tightened a little on the wheel. There's something else you need to know, Elwyn. Something hard. 2 months before your parents' accident, your father lost his job. Forged documents had appeared in his work files at the architecture firm. Documents that made it look like he had committed contract fraud. They couldn't prove anything in court, but the firm fired him anyway. He couldn't get hired anywhere else in Boston. Word travels in that industry. Your grandfather and I always knew where those documents came from. We just couldn't prove it either. My hands were shaking in my lap. They were driving back to Boston when the truck hit them. It was an accident. A terrible, ordinary accident on a wet highway. But the reason your father was a broken man behind the wheel that night, the reason he was driving 16 hours straight, exhausted and grieving, in a thunderstorm, after spending the weekend begging his own father to help him save his career. That was her alone. That was her. I didn't speak for a long time after that. We exited the highway at a sign that said Cedar Hollow, 14 miles. The road narrowed. The trees thickened. October light came down through red and gold leaves in long gold shafts. We passed a small white church with a steeple, then a feed store with sacks of grain stacked on the front porch. We passed a diner painted robin's egg blue with a hand-painted sign that read Bluebird Cafe. The lights were on inside. Someone in a red apron was pouring coffee for someone in a green John Deere cap. An old man in overalls was unloading hay bales from the back of a truck on Main Street. He looked up as we drove past. He squinted at Wendell behind the wheel. His face broke into a grin, and he raised one weathered hand in salute. Wendell raised his hand back. A woman in her 70s was sweeping the sidewalk outside a hardware store. She stopped sweeping. She stared at the truck. She put one hand to her mouth. Wendell Hollister, is that you? She called. He rolled down the window. Hello, Mrs. Pruitt. Her eyes drifted past him. To me, she brought both hands to her face. Lord have mercy, she whispered. Is that little Alistair's girl? I felt the tears coming again, and I didn't even know why. Yes, ma'am, Wendell said softly. This is Eloin. She's come home. The woman started to cry right there on the sidewalk. Right there, in front of the hardware store, with her broom forgotten against the wall. She just stood and cried, and pressed both hands to her face, and shook her head over and over. We drove on, out past the edge of town, onto a narrower road, through a tunnel of bare-limbed oaks that arched over us like the rafters of a church. And finally, at the top of a low-rise, Wendell slowed the truck. A long white fence stretched away from the road on both sides. At the end of a gravel drive stood a tall iron gate, painted black, set between 2 pillars of pale fieldstone. A wooden sign hung from the top of the gate. Donovan Farm, established 1887. Wendell pulled the truck up to the gate and put it in park. He turned to me. There's a loose stone in the left-hand pillar, he said. About chest high. Push it. I climbed out of the truck. The October air smelled of wood smoke and cut hay and the faint sweetness of late apples. Somewhere far off, a rooster crowed. A crow called from the top of an oak. My knees were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I found the loose stone. I pushed. A small panel slid back. Behind it was a smooth black scanner with a thin red line of light moving across its surface. "Slide the bill in," Wendell called from the truck. "Let it read the serial number." My fingers fumbled with the acrylic case. I pulled out the crisp dollar bill. I slid it into the slot. The machine took it with a soft mechanical whisper. The red line tracked across the green ink. A pleasant chime rang out in the cold morning air. The bill slid back out into my hand, and then the ground beneath my feet began to hum. Deep underground motors, hidden under decades of moss and stone, groaned to life. The heavy iron gate began to swing inward, slowly, patient, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to come home. I got back into the truck. Wendell shifted into drive. We rolled through the gates and around a long, sweeping curve. The trees fell away, and I saw it, a wide green valley spread out before us. 240 acres of Donovan land, framed by low blue hills. A pond glittered at the center of the valley, smooth as a held breath. A line of oaks lined a gravel drive. And there, perched on a gentle rise above the pond, stood a tall white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a stone chimney, and a tin roof catching the morning sun. A red barn stood behind it. A row of apple trees, still heavy with red fruit, marched along a far fence line. A line of black cows grazed in a far pasture. Wood smoke rose from the kitchen chimney in a thin white ribbon. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my entire life. Wendell parked the truck on a circle of crushed stone in front of the porch. I got out slowly. My legs would not quite work right. A woman was standing at the top of the porch steps. She was in her late 60s. Silver hair pulled back in a soft braid that lay across one shoulder. A blue gingham apron over a long denim skirt. Her hands were clasped in front of her like a woman in church, waiting for the hymn to begin. When she saw me, her face crumpled. She came down the steps faster than a woman her age had any right to move. She crossed the gravel. She stopped in front of me and stared at me with eyes so full of love and grief that I felt my own face begin to break. "Oh, child," she whispered. "Oh, sweet child." She lifted one trembling hand and touched my cheek. "You came home. You finally came home." I didn't know her. I didn't know her name, but my body knew her. Something deep and animal inside me knew this woman, knew the smell of her. Biscuits and lavender and clean cotton, knew the warmth of her palm against my face. "My name is Opal Whitfield," she said. "I used to bounce you on my knee on this very porch when you were 3 years old. I held you the day you were born. Your daddy and I used to sit right here and shell peas while you slept in a basket at our feet." She was crying now. So was I. "I have been waiting for you for 22 years. I stood in the gravel drive of a farm I did not remember, and a stranger who had loved me my whole life put her arms around me, and for the first time since my parents had died, I let myself break. That night, Opal made supper. Pot roast falling off the bone in a cast iron pot that, she told me, had belonged to her own mother. Buttermilk biscuits still steaming when she pulled them out of the oven with butter melting into the seams. A green bean casserole with crispy onions on top. A pitcher of sweet tea sweating onto a worn wooden table that, Opal told me, my great-great-grandfather had built with his own hands in 1889. We ate by the light of an old brass lamp. The floorboards in the dining room creaked when Opal walked across them. Outside the open kitchen window, crickets sang. An owl called once from the oaks. The whole house smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and the cold, sweet apples cooling on the counter. I ate slowly. I had not eaten a real home-cooked meal since my mother died. After supper, Opal led me into the front parlor. She lit a fire in the stone hearth. She handed me a cup of coffee in a chipped white mug that said Cedar Hollow Farmers Co-op, 1978. She sat in a rocking chair across from me, and she began to tell me the story of my family. My grandfather Silas had been born in the upstairs bedroom of this house in 1949. So had my father Alistair in 1971. So had I, very nearly. Opal told me my mother had gone into labor with me here on a visit, but my parents had made it to a Nashville hospital just in time, with my father driving 90 miles an hour down the country roads and my mother laughing through the contractions in the passenger seat. The Donovan farm had been in our family for 4 generations, 139 years. There were Donovan headstones in the churchyard in town going back to the 1880s. When my grandmother Mary died of cancer in 1987, my grandfather took my father, who was 16, and moved them both up to New York. He needed to be where the business was. He needed to be far from the bed where his wife had died. But he kept the farm. He hired Opal and her late husband Earl to look after it. He brought my father back every summer until my father went to college. He met Vivian in Boston, Opal said softly, rocking. The firelight moved across her face. Your daddy was 19, home from college. He didn't like her from the first. He told your grandfather she was a cold woman, but Silas was lonely. So lonely, and she was a very, very smart woman. She paused. She looked into the fire. She didn't want a husband, child. She wanted a brand. She wanted to be Mrs. Donovan of Donovan Textiles. She wanted the Fifth Avenue address and the Hampton summer. The first thing she did when they got married was sell off your grandfather's rental cottage in Cape Cod where he and Mary used to go. The second thing she did was tell him she would never set foot in Tennessee. The third thing she did was tell him his son was not welcome in their home unless he came alone without that wife of his, meaning your mother. Why didn't he leave her? I whispered. Pride, child, shame. He'd already buried one wife. He thought a divorce would make him look like a fool, and she was clever. She convinced him she loved him just enough, just often enough, to keep him from running. By the time he saw who she really was, she had her name on half his accounts and her son in his offices. And my dad? Opal smiled, and her eyes filled up again. Your daddy was the best boy I ever knew, Elowen. He'd come down here every chance he got. He brought your mama. He brought you. The last time you were here, you were 3. You sat on this very rug and tried to feed an apple to a barn cat. You laughed so hard when the cat licked your wrist that you fell over backward. Why did we stop coming? Because Vivian found out. She told Silas if Alistair didn't break off all contact with the farm, she would destroy him. And after your parents died, child, after they died, she made sure your grandfather couldn't reach you. She told him you wanted nothing to do with him. She told him you blamed him for not being at the funeral. She intercepted every letter he sent, every birthday card, every check. I held very still. How many letters? I asked. Opal looked at me for a long moment. Child, she said gently, you should come with me. If your heart is pounding right now, if you've ever lost someone and wondered if they tried to reach you, if they thought of you, if they loved you, even at the end, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me about someone you loved who you wished you could hear from one more time. The next part of Elowen's story will stay with you for a long time. Stay with me. Opal led me out to the barn. It was past midnight by then. The moon was high and very white. Our breath made small white clouds in the cold air. The barn doors creaked open on hinges as old as the house. The smell inside was clover and old leather and warm dust and horse hay from a generation ago. She walked to the back, to an old wooden tack room piled with bridles and saddle blankets. She knelt in the corner and brushed aside a pile of dry hay. And there, set flush into the floor, was a wooden trap door with an iron ring. She lifted it. A short flight of stone steps led down into a small underground room. Opal turned on a battery lantern. Cool air rose up to meet us. It smelled of cedar and thyme. The room was the size of a small bedroom. The walls were lined with shelves, and against the far wall, set on a low stone platform, stood a heavy steel safe, antique, black. The Donovan name etched in worn gold across the door. Beside the safe, hidden behind a hollowed-out volume of an encyclopedia, was an optical scanner exactly like the one in the gate. I knew what to do without being told. I slid the dollar bill into the slot. The red light scanned. The chime rang. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the safe walls. The handle gave a fraction of an inch. I pulled it open. The safe was deep. Walk-in deep. lined inside with steel shelves and small drawers. On the lowest shelf, neatly stacked, were bound packets of bearer bonds, paper certificates that, Opal told me later, an attorney could quietly convert into roughly $4.8 million without ever requiring a court's permission. Above them, rows of small gold bars wrapped in soft cloth. On another shelf, velvet jewelry boxes containing pieces I would later be told had belonged to my grandmother Mary. A simple gold wedding band, a delicate diamond pendant on a thin chain, a pearl necklace yellowed soft with age. But on the middle shelf, all by itself, sat a single wooden box, old, cedar, carved with my father's initials. I lifted it down with both hands. I sat on the cold stone floor. I opened it. It was full of letters, hundreds of them, each one in a sealed envelope. Each one addressed in my grandfather's shaky handwriting to Elwin Donovan, each one with my old Boston address, and each one, every single one, stamped across the front in faded red ink. Return to sender. Address unknown. I picked one up. The envelope was thin. The postmark said the 14th of August, 2004. I would have been 5 years old. I broke the seal with shaking fingers. My dearest little Ellie, today is your 5th birthday. Your grandma Opal made you a cake on the farm last summer that you wouldn't remember, and I've been thinking about it all day. I hope your daddy gives you a big hug from me today. I hope your mama tells you that your old grandfather thinks about you every single morning when the sun comes up over the pasture. I am so sorry I can't be there to give you your present in person. There is a complicated business reason I can't explain to a 5-year-old, but please know it is not because I do not love you. I love you more than the sky and the dirt and every cow in this county put together. Happy birthday, my sweet girl. All my love forever, Grandpa Silas. I read it once. I read it twice. I held the letter against my chest, and I put my face down against the cold stone floor of that little cedar-lined room, and I cried in a way I had not cried since I was 22 years old. And they wheeled 2 closed caskets into a Boston church. 22 years of letters, birthday cards, Christmas cards, Easter cards, letters when my mother died, letters when I graduated high school, letters when I started college, letters when my parents were killed, 3 of them in a single week, begging me to write back, begging the post office to find a forwarding address, begging the universe to let him hold his only granddaughter just one more time. Every one of them returned. Every one of them intercepted by a woman in Boston who had paid someone at my old apartment building's mailroom to flag any letter from a Tennessee address and send it back unread. I had grown up believing no one wanted me. And the truth was that an old man at a kitchen table in Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, had been writing to me every month of my life. I do not know how long I stayed down there. When I finally sat up, Opal was sitting on the steps. She was wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. She had brought down a tin of biscuits and a thermos of coffee, like she had known we were going to be down there a long time. She held me. I let her. He loved you, child, she said into my hair. He loved you so much. It was past 3 in the morning when we climbed back up the steps and closed the trap door and walked across the moonlit yard toward the house. That was when the first window broke. It was a small, sharp sound from the back of the house. Glass, followed by silence. Opal froze. Her hand closed on my arm. Get behind me, she whispered. I will tell you something I learned that night about a 68-year-old woman raised on a Tennessee dairy farm. She is not afraid of much. She walked across the porch like a woman walking to a Sunday service. She slipped inside through the screen door without making a sound. She picked up a black telephone from a small table in the front hall. Old, rotary. The cord coiled like a snake. She dialed 3 numbers. She spoke very quietly. Sheriff Buchanan, this is Opal Whitfield out at the Donovan place. We have an intruder. I would surely appreciate it if you would come on out. She set the phone down. She crossed to a tall wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. She opened it, and she took out a long shotgun. Polished walnut stock. She broke it open, fed in 2 shells from a drawer, and snapped it closed. Stay behind me, child, she said. We moved down the hallway. The library door was at the far end. The library was the heart of the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, a massive desk in the center, and behind the desk, hidden in a closet built into the wall, another door, another vault. I had not seen it yet, but someone else was trying to. We heard a man's voice, low, urgent, cursing. Opal eased the library door open. A man in a wrinkled gray suit was crouched in front of the back wall. He had pulled aside a tapestry. He had revealed a heavy steel door set flush into the brick. A metal pry bar lay at his feet. Sweat was running down his face. His hair was stuck to his forehead. His hands were trembling. He turned when the door opened. I recognized him. He had been at my grandfather's law firm, a junior partner. I had seen him only once in the hallway outside the conference room. He had nodded at Wendell and then ignored me. His name was Garrett Mallory. He saw us. He saw the shotgun in Opal's hands. He went very, very still. "Mr. Mallory," Opal said. Her voice was calm. "Calm in the way an old farmer is calm when he sees a snake. I think you have lost your way. The road out of Cedar Hollow is in the other direction." He stood up slowly. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'm just doing my job. I'm an attorney. I represent Mrs. Ashcombe. There are assets in this house that legally belong to my client's estate, and I am here to—" "You are here," Opal said, "in the middle of the night, in my client's house, with a pry bar. I do not believe that is generally how lawyers conduct business." I stepped out from behind her. When Garrett saw me, something shifted in his face. He did the math fast. He saw me holding the wooden box. He saw the broken seal on the envelope in my hand. He saw the dollar bill on the desk where I had set it down hours before. "Miss Donovan," he said, very smoothly, "I'm so sorry. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I was sent down here to verify some documents. Mrs. Ashcombe was concerned about the state of the property. If you'll just give me that dollar bill, I can have all of this sorted out by morning." "You went to Vanderbilt with Dorian," I said quietly. It was a guess, but the way his face moved told me it was the right guess. "That doesn't have anything to do with— how much is she paying you?" He blinked. "Excuse me? Vivienne, how much?" He stared at me. For a long moment, he looked like a man trying to decide whether to keep his lie or to switch to a different one. Then his face changed again. Something in him broke loose. "You stupid little girl," he said. His voice had gone quiet and ugly. "Do you have any idea what she has on me? I've been cleaning up her son's bookkeeping for 3 years. I have forged signatures on 6 different real estate transactions. If she goes down, I go to federal prison. So, yes, she is paying me $5 million to walk out of this house with that dollar bill and the contents of whatever vault is in this wall. And I am going to do it." He bent down. His hand closed around the pry bar. He stepped toward me, a man with iron in his hand and nothing left to lose, stepping toward me in a dim library at 3 in the morning. Opal moved. She did not raise the shotgun to fire. She raised it to swing, and she brought the heavy walnut stock down across his wrist with the same clean, hard motion I had seen her use earlier in the evening to drive a fence post into the ground. He screamed. The pry bar clattered to the floor. He stumbled backward. In the distance, sirens. Red and blue lights bloomed against the library window. Sheriff Buchanan arrived with 2 deputies 11 minutes after Opal made that phone call. He was a heavy, calm man in his late 50s with a salt and pepper mustache and tired, kind eyes. He took one look at the broken window, the pry bar on the floor, the steel door behind the tapestry, and Garrett Mallory clutching a wrist that was almost certainly broken. He took my statement. He took Opal's statement. He took Garrett's wallet, his phone, and his car keys. He took Garrett. Sometime around dawn, Wendell Hollister, who had been staying at a bed and breakfast in town, came up the gravel drive in his old Ford pickup. I sat on the porch, swing wrapped in a quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender. The sun was coming up pink and orange over the pasture. Opal pressed a cup of coffee into my hands. Wendell sat down next to me. He smelled of pipe, tobacco, and aftershave. "There's something else in the vault you haven't opened yet," he said gently. "He left it for you. Whenever you're ready." I was ready. We went back into the library. Wendell entered a 6-digit code on a small keypad, hidden behind a row of books. The steel door swung open. This vault was smaller than the one in the barn. It wasn't full of money, it was full of paper. Ledgers, spreadsheets, bank statements, photocopies of forged signatures with the originals stapled to them, years of evidence of fraud, of embezzlement, of contracts moved into Vivienne's name without my grandfather's knowledge, of company shares signed over using a signature that was very, very close to his, but not quite. On top of it all sat a thick manila envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's shaking handwriting. I sat down at the desk. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, and a small folded note, and a business card from a federal agent based in Nashville. The letter said, "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, my plan has worked. For the last 18 months of my life, when the doctors told me I would not see another spring, I made a decision. I would not die quietly. I would not let her keep what she stole. I went to the federal government. I told them everything. I gave them every document I had. They have been building a case ever since. Your visits to me each Sunday these last months saved my life in a way you cannot understand. Every cookie, every story, every time you held my hand. I had spent 40 years believing I deserved what Vivienne had done to me, because I had failed your grandmother, because I had not protected your father, because I had let you grow up believing you were alone. And then you came, and you did not ask for one single thing. You came because I was sick. You came because I was your grandfather. You came because you loved me. The dollar I left you in that public will is a key. You know that now. But the truth, Ellie, the truth is that you were already the richest thing in my life. You were my real inheritance. You, my girl. The way you walked into that hospital room with cookies in a brown paper bag and your daddy's eyes, that was when I knew I could finally rest. Take care of the farm, take care of Opal, take care of Cedar Hollow, and please, my sweet girl, let yourself be loved. Your grandfather, Silas." I cried. Of course, I cried for a long time. Then I unfolded the small note. It was a single line in my grandfather's hand. It said, "P.S. Thank you for the cookies." I laughed out loud. Through the tears, and the laugh felt like something cracking open inside my chest, something old and rusted and heavy, something that had been closed for 22 years. If you have ever loved someone who didn't get to see how loved they were before they died, if you have ever wished for one more chance to say thank you, or I'm sorry, or I love you, pause here for a moment, take a breath, and tell me their name in the comments below. Let's hold their memory together. And if this story is moving you, please don't forget to subscribe. There is one more chapter, and it is the most important one of all. The next morning, Wendell called the number on the business card. 3 days later, Agent Yolanda Pierce of the Federal Investigative Office in Nashville drove up the gravel road in a plain black sedan. She was a tall, calm woman in her 50s with silver-threaded hair pulled back tight. She wore a navy blazer. She drank her coffee black. She listened more than she talked. She sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours that afternoon. She read every page from the vault. She asked me questions about my grandfather, about Vivienne, about the years between my parents' funeral and my grandfather's death. She wrote nothing down. She did not need to. Her eyes were the kind of eyes that saw everything and forgot none of it. When she was done, she stood up. She set her empty coffee cup in the sink. She turned to me at the kitchen door. "Miss Donovan," she said, "your grandfather did a brave and careful thing. We've been building this case for 14 months. What you've given me today is the last brick we needed. The wall is complete." She thanked me. She drove away. For 6 months, nothing happened in the news. For 6 months, I lived at the farm. I learned how to drive a pickup truck on a gravel road. I learned how to feed chickens. I learned to recognize the difference between the sound of an owl and the sound of a fox in the dark. Opal taught me how to make biscuits the way my grandmother had made them, with cold butter cut into the flour with the back of 2 knives. She taught me how to make pot roast and apple butter and chicken and dumplings. Bo Caldwell, the 71-year-old man who owned the feed store in town, showed me how to mend a fence. He was a short, square man with a weathered face and a kind smile. He came out to the farm every Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee and a bag of fence staples. He told me that in 1985, when his own farm was about to go under, my grandfather had loaned him $40,000 and told him he could pay it back whenever he could. He had paid every penny back within 10 years, with no interest. Your grandfather was the kindest hard man I ever met, Bo told me, leaning on the porch rail one evening with a glass of sweet tea. He could close a deal in New York that would make grown men weep, and then he'd come down here and slip a $100 bill into the church collection plate when he thought no one was looking. He paid for half the new roof on the elementary school in 1992. He paid for Pastor Reed's daughter to go to nursing school. He never wanted his name on anything. He just wanted it done. Sutton Boone, who ran the Bluebird Cafe in town, became my best friend. She was 29 years old, divorced 2 years, raising a 4-year-old son named Levi, who had her dark curls and a gap between his front teeth that reminded me painfully of the photograph of my father on the truck visor. She put a permanent table aside for me by the window of the cafe. She started teaching me to bake pies. She told me her own grandmother had been my grandfather's secretary at the textile warehouse in Brooklyn for 30 years, before she retired to Tennessee. Everyone in Cedar Hollow, it seemed, had a story about my grandfather. Pastor Ezekiel Reed came out to the farm every Wednesday for supper. He was a 58-year-old man with a slow voice and kind eyes and a habit of bringing a jar of his wife's homemade peach preserves whenever he came. He had grown up in Cedar Hollow. He had known my father since they were boys. He told me stories about Alistair as a boy. About the summer, Alistair had built a treehouse in the big oak by the pond, with my grandfather hammering nails right alongside him. About the time Alistair had brought a wounded sparrow into the church one Sunday and refused to put it down through the entire service. The community took me in like I had never left. I think, in some way I did not yet understand, I never had. In late April, the news broke. It started small. A short article in a local Nashville paper about a federal investigation into a major textile company. Then it grew. Within 2 weeks, every business news outlet in the country was covering it. Vivian Ashcombe had been arrested at a regional airport in Tennessee while attempting to board a private flight to a country with no extradition treaty. She had been pulled off the tarmac in handcuffs. Her son, Dorian Ashcombe, had been arrested the same afternoon at his apartment in Manhattan. Federal prosecutors had charged Vivienne with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and forgery based on years of evidence showing she had quietly moved my grandfather's company shares into her own name using a forged version of his signature. Dorian had been charged with tax fraud and conspiracy. The Donovan empire collapsed in a single business quarter. The penthouse on Fifth Avenue was seized to satisfy creditors. The yacht was sold at auction. The Hamptons house, the Chicago real estate, the controlling shares of Donovan Textiles, all of it had been quietly leveraged against debts that came due all at once. When the balloon payments hit, there was nothing left. My grandfather, in his last year of life, had drawn the final knot tight. I drove up to New York for the sentencing. I did not have to. The prosecutor told me I did not have to. But I needed to be in that room. Vivienne wore a beige jumpsuit. No gold, no designer suit. Her hair was not pulled back tight anymore. It hung loose around her face. She looked smaller than I remember. The kind of smaller that has nothing to do with weight and everything to do with the absence of an audience. When she was let in, her eyes found me in the gallery. She stared at me for a long, slow moment. I did not say a word. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out the crisp $1 bill. I held it up, just for a second, just long enough for her to see it. Then I folded it in half. I tucked it back into my pocket. She closed her eyes. The judge sentenced her to 22 years in federal prison. 22 years! The same number as the years she had stolen from me. I drove back to Tennessee that night. 16 hours, mostly in the dark, through the long valleys of Virginia. I had the windows down for the last hour, just to smell the air, just to feel the cold, clean wind off the pasture on my face. When I turned onto the gravel drive of Donovan Farm and saw the porch light on Opal waiting on the steps, the pasture silvered with moonlight, my eyes filled up one more time, but not from grief. Not this time. A year passed. I opened a small art studio in the barn. I painted the doors blue. I called it the Alistair Donovan Art Studio, after my father. I taught free classes to the children of Cedar Hollow on Saturday mornings. We made watercolor paintings of the pasture. We made clay birds. We made portraits of grandmothers. Sometimes the parents stayed and took the class with their children. Sometimes Pastor Reed came and sat at the back of the room and read a book. Sutton's little boy Levi was my first student. Bo Caldwell brought me a basket of tomatoes from his garden every Sunday for a whole summer. He taught me how to can them in glass jars with two-piece lids. My pantry filled up with jars of red tomatoes and green beans and pickled okra and apple butter, and Opal said it was the first time the pantry had looked right in 20 years. Pastor Reed baptized Sutton's second baby, a little girl, in the creek behind the church the next spring. Her name was Ruby, Sutton's grandmother's name. Her middle name was Elowen. When Sutton told me in the back room of the Bluebird Cafe over 2 cups of coffee that she wanted to give her daughter my name, I sat down on a stool and cried so hard I couldn't speak for 10 minutes. Sutton just sat next to me and held my hand and laughed at me and cried with me and finally said, "Lord, woman, get a grip." I used some of the money from my grandfather's vault to establish a scholarship fund for any child from Cedar Hollow who wanted to study art at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where my father and I had both gone. We funded a new wing on the local library and named it after my grandmother Mary. We rebuilt the steeple of the Methodist Church after a windstorm. We paid off the medical debt of every family in Cedar Hollow who had an outstanding hospital bill at the county hospital. We did it quietly. We did not put a name on it. I gave Wendell Hollister a check for his time. He returned it. I sent it again. He returned it again with a note that said, "Your grandfather paid me a long time ago, in a way money cannot match." I left the check uncashed on my kitchen table. I framed his note instead. It hangs in the front hall. On a summer evening in late June, almost 2 years after I had first walked into that cold mahogany conference room in New York and listened to a stranger laugh at the word $1, I sat on the front porch of Donovan Farm with Opal Whitfield. The sun was going down behind the blue hills. The pasture was full of fireflies. Sutton's son Levi was running through the yard in his bare feet, chasing one of the barn cats. Bo Caldwell's old hound was asleep on the porch boards by my feet. Somewhere in the kitchen, Pastor Reed was telling a story that was making my old neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, laugh so hard she had to put down her glass of sweet tea. I was wearing one of my mother's old denim shirts. I had found it in a cedar trunk in the attic the previous winter, with my own baby clothes folded beneath it, and a small leather-bound photograph album. The shirt still smelled, faintly, of her. The album had been full of pictures of me as a baby on this porch. Pictures my father had taken, pictures my grandfather had been sent, pictures my mother had labeled in her loopy schoolteacher handwriting on the back. Ellie, 18 months, first time meeting Grandpa Silas. Ellie and Opal, the porch swing. Ellie chasing a chicken. In my hand was a folded $1 bill, soft now from carrying. The serial number worn but still visible in the porch light. CEDARHOLLOW 1962. The year my grandfather had inherited the farm from his own father. I unfolded it. I looked at it. A thin slip of paper fell out into my lap. I had missed it before. It had been folded so small, tucked so carefully into the seam of the bill where the paper had been doubled over, that I had carried it in my pocket for 2 years without ever knowing it was there. It was a single line in my grandfather's hand. "Welcome home, my Ellie." "Grandpa?" I closed my eyes. I thought of the cold conference room in Manhattan, the mahogany table, the woman in black laughing at the words $1. I thought of how small I had felt walking out of that room, how sure I had been that I was nothing, that nobody had ever wanted me. And I thought of the man in the hospital bed, his paper-thin hand on mine, his whisper, "You have your daddy's eyes." He had known all along that I would find this letter, that I would carry this dollar in my pocket through 2 long years. That one summer evening, I would sit on this porch with all of these people he had loved, and I would finally understand. The dollar had never been an insult. It had been an invitation. I sat there on the porch of my grandfather's house, my father's house, my house, and I listened to the laughter of my friends and the song of the crickets and the soft creak of Opal's rocking chair beside me. I listened to a barn cat purr. I listened to a screen door open and close. I listened to my own heart, beating in my own chest, in the only place on this earth that had ever been waiting for me. Finally, I whispered. The word fell out of me, soft as breath. The word my mother used to say when she came home from a long shift and shut the front door behind her. The word my father used to say when he finished a drawing he had been working on for weeks. Finally, I am home. If this story moved you, if it made you cry, or made you think of someone you love, or made you believe just a little more in the kindness of a small town and the stubborn loyalty of an old man's love, please take one more moment with me. Tap the subscribe button. Leave a comment and tell me your name and the name of one person who has been your Cedar Hollow. One person who showed you what home really meant. Share this story with the women in your life. Your sisters, your daughters, your mothers, your oldest friends. Because somewhere out there tonight, there is a young woman sitting alone in a small apartment, believing no one is writing letters to her, believing no one is waiting on a porch for her, believing she is alone in this world. She isn't. None of us are. There is always a Cedar Hollow somewhere. There is always an opal waiting on a porch. And sometimes, the smallest thing in your pocket, a dollar bill, a folded note, a memory of a person who loved you, is the most precious treasure you will ever own. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Thank you for listening. And from a green pasture in Tennessee, with the fireflies rising and the porch light on, welcome home.